come up here in front of the thing. You should be able to see yourself. And I welcome the first speaker of the Affirmative team.
On the Affirmative team, we see today that someone would much prefer to be born in 100 years' time to today for a number of reasons. Our path to victory today will be to prove to you that the world is progressing for the better future, especially politically and through technology and economically. I will first of all start about talking about the political climate, and then I'll move on to my second point about technology, and my second speaker will split on economics. First of all, for a little bit of characterization about why the world today is like a negative place to be born in. Well, first of all, we see that like politically we're in like a very like far-right extremist sort of situation, and we can see this in places like America, where they voted like in Donald Trump and people are losing rights. We can even see this in New Zealand with like the women's pay equity thing, and we can see that just in general like a lot more extremist parties are coming to power, and they're generally like far-right extremist parties, and we just see this as like generally being a bad thing for most people, especially like women or like people of colour or etc. We also see in terms of technology, like right now, because it's advancing so quickly, it's unreliable, denied. We don't really know like any long-term effects, and we're just sort of in like a bit of like a stalemate about like what actual problems could happen through technology. So first of all, moving on to my first point about how like the political climate in the future will be improved. So first of all, we just like can see there's going to be far less extremism just due to the fact that people will be more educated in general, and they'll have learned from the mistakes that are happening right now in society, because we can see that they're already having negative effects, and we can see that people are already like regretting like their choices of who's in government and stuff, because they're actually realizing like the real life effects that these things have. And we can also see that they're more likely to like level out somewhat to be like a more even like political climate, be a lot more middle ground instead of these like extremist parties getting into power. So I have like three main mix for this. So first of all, like the situation we're in right now is like a humanitarian crisis. People are losing rights. People don't like in superpower Western countries, people are like struggling because of like civil wars within their countries. And we can see that when this has happened before, like when we've reached this point where like people realize like the negative effects of this, and we can see an example of this being like in Nazi Germany in World War II, the countries realized like the massive negative impacts this like political system had, and they like actually came together to like create like a more liberal, like a better future for these people. And we can see this in things like they created the United Nations, you know, they actually had like strategies to make sure this kind of stuff wouldn't happen again. So we can like assume that this would actually happen again after this like humanitarian crisis. It would reach a point and people would realize like that actually we need to change, and we would change for the better because we can see this happen in the past. And moving on to my second mic is that like people are actually much more politically engaged now. We can see this through young people, like generally they actually learn a lot more through like social media, but also they just actually care a lot more about the issues because they actually know about like their immediate future, which just means that in the future these people will still care about these issues, and as will the next generation of young people, which means overall more people actually are more politically informed because they care about these issues, so they want to learn about what's happening, which means they'll make more educated decisions on who they're voting for, and therefore actually want to like have they would know the effects that this person's going to put in place. They wouldn't be like people who currently have voted for Donald Trump have often come out and said like, I didn't know he would actually do all these things, and like they understand now the negative impact it's had. People would have learned from that. They would know who they're voting for and why they're voting for this person, and there'll be just in general less extremist views, because we can see that they're born out of people like being scapegoated, out of certain things being scapegoated, and people just not knowing what the actual issues like come out of. So if they're more educated, they would understand like the bad sides of these extremist views, because they would have seen what's like the problems in the past, but also B, like the positives that being like a bit more like not as an extreme view could actually have, even if it's not like as an immediate impact as they would like. And my third mic for this is like after a humanitarian crisis, like I mentioned, people not only reflect on the actual issue, but also like what caused the crisis, which means just like as tensions are increasing and stuff around social issues today, like women's rights, like as we saw in like the pay equity stuff recently in New Zealand, people actually become more aware of these issues of radicalization, and so like they actually want to make a change against it, which just means in the future these issues will not be as prominent because people have actively made a change towards it. So the outcomes of this is like first of all just generally more educated voting, which means that like no matter what side it's in, people actually wanted like what these people are vouching for, instead of being like misinformed on what they might do, because they actually know who they're voting for. They've got like more ways to access these things. They actually are more politically engaged, because as I mentioned, like young people are politically engaged, which means they will carry on into the future. And it also just means that we'll have less extreme governments, because generally we see that the less educated politically, those people are the more likely to vote for these extreme governments. So it'll be a lot like it's a safer political system. And people will also like learn from the mistakes of the past, which means that they will not have these people losing these rights, these humanitarian crises that are happening now, which just means like in the future it's much safer for a young person to be brought up like politically, because they wouldn't have to worry about like losing rights, about if they're a person of colour having like as many struggles in the world, because people have like learned like what the actual real life effects have on these people. I'll take a POI now.
A lot of these wars exist right now because of resource struggles, for example, in all of Africa. Insofar as these resources are limited, how do you solve these issues 100 years into the future?
Well, 100 years into the future, as I'm going to move on in my next point, we're going to show that we're going to have a lot more technology, which will in turn mean like the technology we have now can be passed on to these poorer nations, because it will be like more mainstreamed. So first of all, as I mentioned, technology is advancing very quickly nowadays in terms of things like medical, like AI, like the internet, like access, who's getting access to the internet. And we can see this like, also we understand there's like going to be less misinformation and stuff. We can already see this starting to happen with like AI checkers, like people are already trying to combat misinformation on the internet, which just means like in the future this will be even more secure. And also there'll be in the future more understanding of like the actual long-term effects the internet and like social media and stuff has on people, because right now no one actually knows like, is it okay to have social media as an under 16, like, because we don't know, because none of those people who are over 16 like have actually grown up with social media, so we can't see these effects. So moving on to my first MEC, so first of all, like about like medical technology, we can see that like medical technology has advanced hugely from like 1925 to 2025, and this is because of like things like we have like robots now who like doctors can control to perform a more precise surgery, and like we even have things like more like easier to make like vaccines and just simple stuff like that. And also like better ways to just like even diagnose someone because of like this technology that's advanced. So we can assume that obviously in the future this will advance even more, and it will also help people who like can't necessarily afford these things, because it means the technology we have nowadays will become more mainstream and more affordable for people in poorer places, like I was mentioning before, which just means that these people actually have like a lot of support technologically, which could help them with like other issues. But specifically, like I've mentioned, medical technology, because that's like a really important issue right now, is people not having access to medicine and stuff. But as technology, like the general tech we have now becomes more mainstream, people will have this access. So secondly, on things like the internet being more reliable. So first of all, we can see, like I mentioned, there's already things like AI checkers for like schoolwork and stuff. But I think we'll also, like, as well as being able to see if it was AI, we can actually like utilize AI, so we're actually using it to its best, because it will be more safe to use. It'll be more secure. Like we have like understanding of like how to check for misinformation within AI. Like we'll just have like a better overall use of AI, which just means it's actually going to help us progress as a society, because we know AI is a really important thing. And then moving on to my third MEC, which is about how we don't see negative technology like becoming a major issue. So we could see things like, for example, like technology be used as weapons. We just don't see this being a major issue, because first of all, like we can see this with like nuclear technology. People now have this idea of like mutually assured destruction, which means any more technology you make is no point of becoming a weapon, because we already know that like the major superpowers have these nuclear weapons. So no one needs to make more, because we're already at like a stalemate that no one's going to use them, because the thing you want as a leader of your country is you want your country to exist. So you're not going to like start a war with someone who has a nuclear weapon against you, which is why we just don't see like any negative technology at all becoming a problem in any way that would like outweigh like medical advancements, because it would never be big enough to like destroy anyone majorly. So the outcomes of this, I'll also mention like the long-term effects, because we'll have like long enough time, we'll understand long-term effects. So the outcomes of this is people have more information politically, people have better medical systems, and it'll just be a more educated and safe world. Thank you.
Awesome, I thank the speaker for the speech, and we'll have the first speaker of the Negating team.
Side Affirmative wants to use the example of Nazi Germany of people righting their wrongs. Note that Hitler was brewing hate for years while rising through the ranks. It took the genocide of millions of innocent people and an entire world war for this change AF claims to occur. On side AF, we see a future riddled with war, instability, and harm. 3 things in this speech then. Firstly, some notes on setup. Secondly, on the instability of the future. And lastly, on the harms of technology. On to setup then, I think the main question to ask here is why does the world actually get worse? Note that we actually heard a lot of this material at AF already, but 3 main things here. Firstly, on education, note that people are generally getting less intelligent, people are getting stupider. Couple reasons why we believe this. Firstly, we tell you that there's an increased presence and thus an over-reliance on AI. And secondly, there are increasing numbers of outlets for people to have their attention distracted, for people to no longer be able to focus on the stuff that's important. This looks like social media trends that are constantly changing. Note that in the future, when these things are exacerbated, when they grow, it becomes increasingly harder to wean yourself off of it. When you're growing up in a generation of using AI, it's a lot harder to then suddenly start doing work on your own then. Next then, on politics, note that politics are generally more volatile. There's a lot of conflicts going around in the world. Think the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine. Couple reasons why this is going to become worse. Note that democracies are becoming increasingly polarized. AF tells you, like the example of America that stands on our side. Secondly, note that America as a whole is like retreating as the world's policeman, right? This empowers the other more hostile, more volatile powers in the world, countries like Russia, countries like China. Thirdly, note that there are multiple powers that are like lifting up, right? There are a lot of countries that are increasing their GDP, that are increasing their capacity to invest in and create weapons of their own. There are a lot more regions around the world that are becoming increasingly powerful and are becoming more threatening. Lastly here then, note that there is an increasing instability within countries, right? This means the governments of these countries are less likely to back down because they have higher stakes involved should a conflict occur, should something like a proxy war occur. Note that this is exacerbated by, when you consider that over time, a lot more countries are becoming more advanced. They're developing more nuclear technology. This is worse in the future. Lastly then, on climate change, note that we've reached the state of no return and people still aren't making an effort to change. Couple things here. Firstly, large governments and corporations have a profit incentive that outweighs their incentive to care about enacting change. This is likely to get worse in the future. Secondly, note that consumerism on the ground is on a rise, right? I told you things about social media trends changing constantly, increasing. A lot of people are now more incentivized, more inclined to buy stuff that directly harms the environment, fund factories that are pumping out fossil fuels. This is particularly bad. And lastly, people in general are becoming largely desensitized to climate harms because they're seeing it all the time. This no longer means this terrible thing to people because they've gotten so used to seeing it. Note that currently we are at the start of these trends. Majority of the world is still at peace. Majority of countries are still relatively stable. This gets worse on AF's side of the house. On my first point then about how the future is generally unstable, what do you need to know here? Well, all the information I just told you in setup. Why is this likely? Why is this polarization specifically likely to increase then? 2 main reasons. Firstly, as algorithms and technology become smarter, as they grow, we hear this from Affirming, we hear that this is going to happen on their side of the house. This means a lot more people are going to become exposed to increasingly sensationalized media. And the sensationalized, polarizing media becomes a lot more normal. It becomes a lot more normal for people to attack each other online, and this results in a general rise of populist ideals, right? Secondly then, we tell you that there's just an increased amount of conflict. We've already told you that a lot of countries are more likely to gain nuclear power in the world. We hear from AF that they're unlikely to use this power because of the existence of a threat of mutual destruction. Why do we think that these countries are still likely to use this technology then? 3 reasons. Firstly, we told you at POI that there is a resource struggle currently. A lot of countries want power, they want a stake on the local stage, and they want to have the ability to defend themselves. Secondly, there is an increased amount of tension between ideologies. A lot more countries are becoming increasingly different from each other, increasing in conflict in each other because they simply want different things for themselves. And lastly, there's just an increased threat of other countries becoming more powerful. If your neighbor has an atomic bomb, you don't want to risk the chance of them dropping that bomb on you. You're likely to develop a bomb of your own. What does this mean? What do we get at the end of this then? Couple things. Note that because a lot of these countries are advancing, this becomes way, way more dangerous. And for the average person on the ground, a world like this is really bad to live in. Note that you're more likely to be born in a battleground 100 years of now. We're standing here in this room where there's like no war, we're not being attacked. This is infinitely more likely 100 years from now. For the average person who's like born in the global south, who already like doesn't have food, who doesn't have water, now are probably going to be bombed, are likely going to be shot. This is really bad. Secondly then, we tell you that there's just an increased amount of like internal chaos within a country, right? This looks like a lot more countries that have unstable governments who are unable to make the correct decisions that like satisfy the majority of their population. This means a lot of people are probably going to be at a lot of unease because they feel that their government is incompetent. A lot of people are probably going to feel like there is an existential threat to their livelihoods. If your entire country is upset at the way you're handling things, this is particularly bad. This is not a world you would want to live in. And lastly, on minorities, we tell you that they're probably going to be treated worse in the world, right? Like right now in America, we see women aren't allowed abortions. They might not even be allowed to get degrees in the future. I've already told you that like a lot of these ideals are going to increase. A lot of people are going to become increasingly volatile, increasingly hateful. This is really bad. Next then, onto my point about technology. Before that, I'll take a POI.
Don't you think that by 100 years' time we will have like learned the effects of this technology and like we'll still be at a stalemate in terms of nuclear war?
Okay, so I already gave you a lot of reasons as to why countries are incentivized to use the nuclear power that they build over time. I've already told you why there is a decreased amount of knowledge, why people are not likely to gain the education, gain the necessary information to like prevent these things from happening. Moving on then to my next point about technology. What do you need to know here? Governments are generally bad at regulating technology. This gets worse in the future. Couple reasons why we believe this. Firstly, tech companies are generally really, really rich. They have a lot of lobbying power over governments. They're able to pass policies that benefit them. Secondly, we tell you that tech often develops a lot faster than it can be legislated. Legislation is a very bureaucratic process. Politicians have a lot to think about. Passing legislation on something that is advancing so quickly is really difficult. And lastly, we tell you that the government often doesn't even want to regulate this technology. Like for these governments, it feels like you're stifling innovation. And these governments probably want to side with the future. They want to side with advancement. Note that you should care that a lot of this harm accrues over time. A large part of AF's case was about how technology is going to become so amazing. If you believe that material, you should believe that tech companies are going to get richer. They're going to gain more power. These harms are worse on their side of the house. Now then, why is tech... More reasons as to why tech is likely to get bad with empowered companies. Note that these companies are driven by profit. You should believe the following. 3 things here. Firstly, we tell you that they're likely to make a lot of technology highly addictive, things that people like heavily rely on. Secondly, it looks like technology that reaches for your most basest emotions, that hinges on the things that make you feel good, that make you feel angry to drive engagement. And lastly, it looks like a lot of companies collecting more data. As technology has an increased presence, as technology becomes like increasingly involved in your life, as you rely more on it, you're probably going to have more data collected from you. What do we get at the end of this? This looks like a lot of people addicted to technology that's like constantly taking information from them. This is particularly bad. It looks like a high invasion of privacy, right? If you're inside your home and you know that you're constantly being watched, that's not a good feeling. That's not a world you want to live in. Proud to negate.
And thanks to you for this speech, and I welcome up the second affirmative to conclude their case.
In today's debate, I'm going to start off with some rebuttal. First on their point on technology, second on their points on political instability, and then I'm going to be going on my split about the economy and the technological advancements and what benefits we are going to see for the economy because of this. Now, first of all, on their first point on instability, right, they tell us that like basically these governments are going to be like incredibly polarized, right, because sensationalized media is going to become the norm, because people are going to have these like radical ideologies, because the media is basically becoming sensationalized, it's becoming unreliable and stuff, to like a pushback to this. First of all, we're already seeing currently in the world that there is more like limitations in legislation being brought up to combat this. We see that like currently in the world, there are being like legislations introduced to stop like younger kids from like being addicted to social media, like in Australia, introducing the like technology ban for social media, and like in France where they do the same thing, right? This is because they know that like children are becoming particularly impacted by this, like gaining like radical views, right? And so we see that just like overall, first of all, there's going to be like less sensationalized media. First of all, because like already we're starting to see progress to making progress towards like stopping this sensationalized media through legislation, right? So in the future, we just see that like overall there is going to be like this less sensationalized media because of this legislation. Secondly, on this, people who like grow up with like social media overall, right, we see that they like become more combated to use it, right? We see that like the generation like Gen Z who grew up with social media are more equipped to like identify AI and stuff and what's real and what's not, because like the older generation hasn't really like grown up with technology and doesn't really know how to like navigate it, right? So we see that just in 100 years in the future, like people are going to be way more accustomed to technology, and they're going to become way more accustomed to like the rapid increases in technology we're going to see. So they're going to be like more able to like actually combat this like new technological landscape, right? And we just see like overall that this means that they're going to be able to like not only navigate this and know like probably what's right and what's wrong, but also because of this legislation we're seeing introduced, we're going to see like people having actual access to like more reliable media. So now on to like some bits about technology, right? We see that they basically said that like governments are like really bad at regulating technology, and this is because tech companies have a lot of lobbying power. Now this is going to come into my like technological advancements and benefits and economics points, so I'm not going to like dwell on this too much, right? But basically like what I want to tell you, like two pushbacks to this. First of all, like as we've heard from first, that we see that like political like ideologies in the world are kind of like shifting, right? When it becomes really radical to the right, most of all it kind of shifts more radical to the left, right? We already see this in our country in New Zealand, like this happens on a like much quicker scale, but we also see this in the world like shifting, right? Like after World War II, the world like shifted to a more like liberal, more progressive perspective, right? Because they wanted to right the wrongs that happened then. So we're going to see this like in the world 100 years from the future. So what does this mean, right? Because the like ideology is moving towards like progressive, right? Because we see this as being like people like wanting to give power to the people, right? We want to see like more democracy. People are kind of fundamentally against the idea of like these big rich companies having control over stuff. Like we see this as like class consciousness, right? So why do we think that tech companies aren't likely to have this like overarching lobbying power over these governments, right? Because of this like scrutiny thing that I'm going to come on later, about this idea that because like this political ideology is shifting more towards more progressive, towards more like democratic, right? We see that people are just like more likely to just be like scrutinizing these governments for giving that power to these like lobbying technological companies, right? And so we just see overall like if these governments are going to be like shifting towards like more progressive ideologies, right, towards more like people-centered focused like ideologies, right, they're going to be more likely, more incentivized to actually listen to the people. And so we see that like 100 years in the future, because this like idea of like the global world just being more like for the people, for democracy and stuff, we see that governments are going to act the same way too, because they need to like kind of have that power, right? Also, like on this kind of like regulating technology idea that the government, like I just want to further like reaffirm that like the government wants to regulate technology, right? Like we believe that like overall like this is good, right? Because the government is like regulating technology, right? They actually are able to like we do see like progress being made to like actually have governments regulating technology proper, right? Like I've already told you before, like the Australian government intervening to make sure that social media isn't becoming like an overarching like power over young kids, right? We're already seeing that this progress is being made to like actually like have power over it, right? So we just see that like overall like this is another reason why that like governments are going to be better at regulating technology, right? And it's also like they just need to, because of the rapid increase of like technological advancement, right? They'll need to keep up with it to actually function. Also, like, even if you don't really buy that, like, we don't even really believe that tech companies gaining power is like necessarily bad, right? We believe that if there are like more tech companies and like more technological advancements, we're going to see like more tech companies overall, right? We see that like these tech companies are going to like introduce competition within this like technological market, right? So what do we see becoming of that? We see that this is becoming like cheaper technology to utilize, right? Because they're actually needing people to like use these technological advancements, these like technologically advanced medical devices and things. Like there's this competition that's going to rise, right? This means that this like this technology is now going to become like cheaper, right? It's going to become more accessible. And so we're just going to see like overall like this trickle down. So even if you don't want to buy like why the government's good at regulating the technology and stuff, we also tell you that it's actually good for our side. Now I want to talk a little bit on the economy, right? I want to talk a little bit about why technological advancement is really good for our side. So first of all, we just want to really stress that like the current economic state of the world is really, really bad, okay? We see like corporations having like an overarching amount of power over the people, which is causing a lot of like climate issues, and it's causing a lot of like economic issues. We see like cost of living crises being like really like strife within the world. We see like medical inaccess, like the insulin costs in the USA, right? And like just like this huge cost for like medical insurance in the USA. And we also see like people just being like stuck in this cycle of like being in the working class struggle because of like capitalism, right? Like these are the effects of late stage capitalism. So basically this sees like people like not being able to like afford to give their kids education. It means people can't afford food, gas, housing. This is really bad, especially for like poorer people, which I really want you to consider when I'm talking about all of this, okay? Now, so what are we going to see, like what are the positive economical benefits we're going to see occurring from this increase in technology? First of all, people are going to be like more aware of like living hardships, of like economic like hardship, right? And this is really important because we tell you that people are going to be working towards change within the world, right? First of all, this is because there's like an increased political engagement and increased advocacy for like economic reform in the world. This is because of like social media. This is because of technology. Like people are actually being connected. People are actually being like engaged with each other, and they are able to have this like increased like participation in this, right? Second of all, we tell you that like this is particularly important, right? Because people are becoming aware of like this economic hardship. And this is really important, right? Because this is what ignites change. We see this like in the USA with Luigi Mangione, right? We see that like because of what he's done, right? We see that he's basically like ignited this class consciousness within the USA. This is really important because it means there's going to be better living standards overall, and so people are going to be brought out of this. Therefore, we are very proud to affirm.
I thank the speaker for the speech, and I welcome up the second speaker of the Negating team to continue their team's case.
Good to go. The age in which you are born will define everything about your life. The life that you're able to live, the retirement that you're able to have, the meaning you're able to get out of existence. When you get incredibly speculative benefits from after day about what the world looks like 100 years from now, we say, don't play Russian roulette with your life. 3 things I want to touch on in this speech. First, on their case around technology and how we can actually deal with that. Second, their other main push around this idea of politics, and I'll show you why the world 100 years from now just looks incredibly, incredibly worse. Thirdly, I'll deal with their material on economics by showing you why inequality just gets rapidly, rapidly worse on their side. Great. First, on this idea of technology, essentially they tell you two things. They give you two pushes here. First, they tell you that the internet is going to self-improve over time, and then secondly, that science in general, particularly medicine and things like that, are also going to improve over time. I just want to quickly deal with this idea of the internet and how this is self-regulation. Two things to note here. First, I think that the internet industry and social media is going to get much more saturated over time. What that means then is you're likely to have different AIs telling you what's true and what's not, different news sites telling you what's true and what's not. I think that in the future then, that the world becomes a much more confusing place on their side of the house. What that means then is this idea of people learning about things and improving just doesn't quite stand. But then secondly, what I want to tell you here is that technology and the internet industry is likely to become more monopolized over the future. Because note that these industries are incredibly high barrier. You have to invest thousands of dollars in things like servers. You have to invest thousands of dollars in things like R&D. That means they don't get the competition on their side. That means with every new technological advancement that gets rolled out, you see more and more market share and more market power being concentrated in the hands of a few very, very powerful industries. And I think that's what our case just takes advantage of. Then let's move on to science in general. First, I'll just note again that the same logic applies to monopolization. Like, the more time goes on, I think the more monopolization occurs in this market, the make on competition just doesn't stand. But the second thing then I'll note is that technological companies get more power outside of the government and they can skirt more and more regulation. I think that's what Mishti was telling you at first. Note that the impacts of this then are fourfold. First, you're more likely to see incredibly addictive technology that tries to break your contact with the outside world because that's just what makes the most profit. If they can retain you on these platforms forever and ever, that's how they get the most revenue. But then secondly, you're more likely to see an invasion of privacy, which Mishti was just starting to allude to. It looks like constantly having your data taken from you. It looks like constantly having the eye of big tech behind you. I think that's an incredibly anxiety-inducing time to live in history. But then thirdly, that looks like more invasive technologies, trying to get inside you physically, like Neuralink, things that try to destroy your sense of self, like the singularity. What then on their side of the house then is I think you get a world where the boundary between yourself and technology becomes blurrier and blurrier. But then fourthly and finally, just want to note on this idea of increased environmental degradation, because you get two things here. First, you get an increase in the severity of climate change because people are using more and more energy to run these technology companies, but then that exacerbates climate change. But then secondly, empowering these companies means you're more likely to see environmental damage in the form of increased mining and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, at the end of this clash then, I think it's unlikely you see the types of technological change that they want, that will make your life incredibly better. Instead, the much more likely harm, knowing the actors involved, is that we empower the worst of the worst in the technology sector, the people who will ruin your life. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
Yeah, so if there are checks and balances placed now for the internet, for AI, for social media, then why is this not likely to continue with technological advancement?
I think this isn't likely to happen because of what Mishti told you in her first speech. As time goes on, these companies become more powerful, technology becomes harder to track, they become richer and can lobby their governments more. What that means then is these companies are harder to pin down in the future. Then let's talk about this idea of political progress, and that's the other main push in this debate. They say essentially two things here. First, people are more likely to be politically engaged, but then second, that they'll realize after disasters that they need to reflect and they need to change. I'll deal with this idea of reflecting first. First, this implies that you have to have a disaster before you actually do these things. Note two things here. First, it's really, really hard to rebuild out of these disasters in whatever shape, way, or form they may actually look like. What that means then, the world is probably just a crappier place to live in. But then secondly, firstly, like that's still an incredible harm in the short term of lives being destroyed, of lives being cut short. That's something that they need to contend with when you're born into this kind of world. It's better just to stay in the present and to not have to deal with that. But then let's deal with the second part of this case around political engagement. First, note that we have increasingly sensationalized tech because that's what the profit motive dictates in the long term. What that means then is that their education is just a euphemism for brainwashing that makes the rise of strongmen easier, not harder. Secondly, note what Mishti again told you about an increasing resource struggle. We will at some point in the next 100 years reach peak oil. We will have minerals and land becoming scarcer. I think that makes politics more toxic. It makes things more unstable. That contributes to the rise of strongmen again and again. But then thirdly, I think that's more time for hateful rhetoric to become normalized, right? The rise of hate is something that takes time on their side of the house. What trends you can see in the present probably get worse over time. But then finally, I want to note what a ruined climate actually does for this debate. It means that economies are more unstable. It means that there are less resources for everyone to share around. It means people being displaced from their homes in huge refugee waves. That's the source of political instability that drives the rise of dictators or dictator wannabes like Trump. Let me remind you then that all of their harms about more arbitrary detention, more political discord get worse on their side of the house. Finally, I want to speak to this idea of inequality. They tell you that inequality is going to get better over time because of a political reckoning. Three things I want to note here. Note that this is my extension. First, you're pushing more people out of jobs when you have like this technology that's becoming more and more productive, right? Because people are getting replaced in favour of more productive things. But then secondly, you increase the gap in knowledge and specialisation. You increase the barrier to get into the upper classes, right? Because you need to be trained to use these things. You need to be trained to understand these things. That's not something that the average person on the ground can actually have access to. Then thirdly and finally, you're restricting the means of production to fewer and fewer people. That's a smaller and more privileged upper echelon that most people can't break into. The impact of this then are threefold. First, you just get this huge gulf between the rich and the poor. They want to mention Luigi Mangione. Fine, we get more of that, more instability on their side of the house. But then secondly, that's just an unbreachable gulf for the average person to have to contend with, right? Note then that when the rich get richer, prices rise. That means that the life of the average person just gets harder and harder. Then thirdly and finally, you get huge resentment that makes society less stable. Again, we can take all of their impacts on that. At the end of the day then, you should not gamble away the entirety of your life on some fake promise of stability or improved technology. Don't play Russian roulette.
I thank the second speaker for their speech. I welcome up the third affirmative to conclude this expanded portion of the debate.
This debate comes down to four main points of clash. 5. Education, politics, climate, technology, and equality. By proving that we win on every single one of these points, we can complete our path to victory and win this debate by proving that the world is going to be progressing to a better future. Firstly, on education. We hear a huge push from the affirming team about sort of the fact that people are getting less educated, the role of AI and sort of the increase in more avenues for distraction, which is going to cause like the average person to become less educated. We see this as simply not being true. As we start to sort of gain more understanding of AI and its role, we see that there is increased regulation in the way it can be used. In schools, in tests and everything like this, we see that there is a much sort of bigger understanding of the harms it can cause, and much more regulation is being put in place to stop it from being used. On our side of the house, we get all the benefits of AI, but in 100 years, when we have the sort of the regulation and these things fully finessed, we get the benefits without these sort of really harmful sort of negatives that we currently get on the negating side. So for those reasons, we win this kind of idea of education. Secondly, onto politics. We hear this big push from the negating team about politics getting more volatile, and how things like nuclear weaponry and nuclear armament are going to cause sort of increased tensions and increased problems in the future. We see this as, again, simply not being true. We tell you that people are becoming more politically educated, right? As educations are increasing, and sort of with these newer generations, we see that there's like a bigger push on people having like this political education. Like, it's just the kind of the culture that we're sort of cultivating around these things. It means that as these people get more educated, they can make decisions that are going to better align with their futures, right? It means that 2 generations sort of down the line, in 100 years, we're going to be facing like a far better political climate, right? The people that will be voting in are going to be people that are going to far better benefit us. Secondly, on this point about the idea of the nuclear threat, right, and how this is going to progress to like a really big problem in the future. We see this as not being true. As we know, there are like many treaties in place. Like, we have this sort of limited test ban treaty, which stops a lot of countries from developing nuclear weapons. Secondly, we see this idea that it's not in the best interest of superpowers to let every single country have nuclear weapons, right? Of course, you don't want some, crazy small country in like, Africa or the Middle East to sort of have like huge scale nuclear capability, and for these reasons, because it's simply not in the best interest of these larger countries, they stop this from happening. They do it today, they will be doing it in 100 years. Secondly, we have this idea of mutually assured destruction, right? We know that when one country launches a nuke, it will result in just total Armageddon, right? Everybody knows this. For that reason, we see it as, simply not being viable that any one country, of these very limited superpowers that can get access to these weapons, are they going to do this? We see every single, foreign policy advisor and like nuclear policy advisor in any like developed country today agrees that mutually assured destruction is the #1 way to stop any sort of potential warfare in the future. If they say it, it's good enough for us, especially going into the future. This means that we win this point on politics, right, and this idea of volatility. And when we win this, we can show that in the future we're going to get a world where it's going to be more peaceful, right? There will be a better chance for people to thrive with like less warfare and less bloodshed all across the board. Secondly, onto this idea about climate change. We hear from the negating team that climate change is kind of past the point of no return, and because of the profit incentive of like large corporations, we're very unlikely to see sort of any backtracking of these policies and the things that are doing these things. We see this, it's not true. We have companies, we see them today, they're incentivized to like be climate active, right? It's like a really big push for a lot of companies that they can claim that they have like sort of pro climate goals, right? And this is the thing that draws people to them. Yes, of course they have a political a profit incentive, but this profit incentive drives them to want to be sort of more environmentally friendly. This is something that people look for in today's society, and for that reason, we see that these companies are going to sort of have more of a sort of an environmental push in the future. We can see this with like airlines. We can see this, even with mining and things like that. They try to find better ways to do it, and to sort of to limit this as much as possible, so that shareholders want to stay, so that people continue to sort of buy into these businesses. I'll take a POI.
When sea levels rise and resources are running dry, when your country is literally running out of water due to climate change, does life, society, and politics get more or less stable?
We see it as, this not being the case. This is not what's going to happen. We are not that far down the sort of climate change route yet. We see that people are like really pushing for positive change at the moment, and these things are having, positive impacts on the world we live in. For these reasons, we see it's not going to get this far. And, the sort of the worse the situation is, the more desperate people get to find a solution to the problems they're in. And for these reasons, there's going to be sort of a bigger push on climate change, which is why we see this as being less of a problem in the future. On the point on technology, we hear this huge push again about like AI and how AI is going to tell you what's true and what's not, and this is going to be the be-all and end-all for the way things are run. This is, entirely speculative. We see that even today, people are more aware of like the failures of AI. We have these things, people want their AIs to be sourced. That's something that we have today. ChatGPT, people don't trust it anymore unless you can like link to where all this information comes from. We see that it's not going to end up being some like guru that everyone relies on, which can then manipulate people in whatever way it wants. Secondly, this idea that tech companies will become more monopolized. We see this, we see new startups happening all the time. This happened with the tech industry at the moment, and it sort of continues to happen and will continue to happen into the future. New people have new ideas, and these ideas are implemented, and they start to take up a portion of the market, and these things become like the new big things, right? We see this to continue to happen. So we don't see that any sort of one company is going to end up becoming some like huge monopoly on it, right? Secondly, this idea that the companies are only acting in their best interests and how this is going to result in like way worse situations for everyone. We see this as not being the case. We see like in today's world, there's like increased scrutiny about the actions of companies, right? We see that they work towards like, or they're under sort of way more watchful eyes of the government, of different people. We see that even today, like all these like huge tech companies, they're always being like called into hearings in like America and stuff, like the privacy concerns, and they're like ordered to stop some of like the more unethical actions that they're taking, right? We see this regulation happening today, and we see it only getting better into the future, right? And for those reasons, we win on this idea of technology, right? Which is like a huge point of this debate and a reason that we won. Finally, really quickly on equality. We have this idea from the Negating team that minorities are going to be treated worse, right? We see like women today who aren't able to get like abortions in America, might not be able to get degrees in the future. We don't see this to be true. Like the Negating team is operating on this idea that sort of trends always continue. We see this as not being true. We have like the civil rights movement, people push back against it, resulting in positive change, which is something we'll see in the future. Thank you.
For their speech, and I welcome up the third speaker of the Negating team to conclude the final substantive speech of this debate.
We learned from 1945, but yet there's the Russian-Ukraine crisis. There are wars around the world that are happening today. Opposition makes the fundamental mischaracterization because everything is different. As things are changing, as AI is progressing, wars are becoming different, everything is becoming different, which means that even if people are to learn from their past, right now we are not living in the past, we are living in the present, and the present is different to the past. A few issues in this debate. Firstly, on politics. Secondly, on technology. Under politics, then, a few things. Firstly, the big push there is that right now there's extremely far-right stuff, there's more extremism, etc. But people will know they can counteract this because of political education. A few responses here. The first thing we'd say is just that right now, obviously, we still aren't to the degree that we are far-right yet. This looks like, for example, the fact that Australia and Canada have literally just voted in centre-left governments. We'd say that right now this still exists because there isn't such things such as polarization yet. Why does it get worse on their side of the house? A few reasons here. First, Firstly, note that as you progress into a more unstable society, it means that people want like strong men that, for example, who are like Trump. They continually buy into these narratives because they want these strongman people in times of instability. What that means is that more people like Trump are likely to get into power, and obviously that's harmful because in the future, insofar as there is a resource crisis, insofar as there are all these harms, it means that on their side of the house, people like Trump are more likely going to come in. But secondly, even if you don't buy that analysis, we give you another approach, political polarization. And note that one thing, because opposition assumes that people will just respond to political polarization. But we'd say that things like polarization are extremely coercive. This is because obviously you need to buy into things like the media. People obviously believe this because it seems extremely appealing because they're promoting extremely good policy. What that means is that people are also likely going to become more polarized when politics become more polarized. Now that's extremely harmful because what that means is that when views disagree, it means people are going to be more angry because they are more spread apart within the political spectrum. What that means is that it gets far worse on their side of the house. Because what political polarization does is it shifts people's views, and that means more extremism, that means more right-wing stuff. So at the end of this then, it means that it's far worse on their side of the house. Far-right extremism is likely going to increase. But note that even if you don't believe that, we'll weigh that on all the things like resource crises, as I'll get to into my next part of the clash. The second part of this clash they talk about is in terms of things like humanitarian crises. We'd say a few things here. The first thing we question is why these things actually exist. Because note they just said humanitarian crises exist. They never provided any analysis why. We'd say a few reasons why this exists. Firstly, we'd say that there are things such as resource struggles. This looks like the fact that China wants to mine cobalt in the Congo. This looks like the fact that there have been resource depletions all around the world. What that means is that resource depletion is limited, and that's extremely bad. Because what that leads to is it leads to more wars. It leads to China funding more proxy wars within, for example, Africa, and that's extremely harmful, as I'll get onto later. They say that you can now learn from these mistakes simply. We say that absolutely no, you can't. The first thing to note is obviously this is extremely situational. Because resources are decreasing, this was not a problem in 1945. It means that circumstances are different, which means that you can't learn. But secondly, we'd also say that a lot of these countries have neo-colonial incentives. They want to be strongman, being seen as I'm defending everybody from the West. The West is so bad, I'm going to continue providing my messages. I'm going to support these people. This strongman image is especially what will exacerbate a lot of war, and insofar as China and the US are more likely to engage in proxy wars, it means that this is extremely harmful. This is crucial because it means that war exists and it's likely going to get far worse on their side of the house, A, because of the resource struggle, but B, because these people have increasing incentives to be neo-colonial against the West. That's extremely harmful because that shows you in terms of politics, A, it is getting more polarized, but B, it is getting far more dangerous because it gets more extreme on their side of the house. Before I move on to technology, I'll take a PI.
Don't you think that as social media regulation increases, like we showed in our example about the Australian government, polarisation will decrease?
Okay, I'll get to that later, but the basic gist is that insofar as things like AI are constantly changing, the extremely speculative, regulations constantly need to take time to get evolved, etc. I'll go into that into my clash. Firstly then, in terms of technology, and a few questions. Education, environment, medical things, and nuclear. Firstly, on education. And note that they tell us that the only response is that people will now know about AI checks, etc. But we'd say a few things. Firstly, note that this is only mitigatory, but we'd say that AI is extremely bad. A few reasons here. Firstly, note that obviously AI learns off a lot of the data that exists on social media and exists based off data sets. That means it's going to be extremely biased. But secondly, we'd also say, therefore, that insofar as these media companies are profit motivated, they're likely going to use these AI systems for extremely bad things. AI is extremely speculative because what we only have now are things like language learning models. In the future, there's likely going to be 7-10 different types of AI, which A, you can't regulate, but B, it's also extremely speculative, so you don't know how to defend against that, and people don't know how to defend against that in terms of education. But even if you don't believe that, we'd say that the incentives are extremely bad right now. Firstly, note that Alan told you that this takes people's jobs, and secondly that these people have to be trained. They never responded to that, because then that therefore means that there is an exacerbation of inequality completely that needs to be taken account for. But secondly, we'd also say that these things are going to be monopolized, etc. Their response to this was just that you're going to get regulation, etc. But regulation doesn't work for a few reasons. The first thing we'd say is obviously note the amount of lobbying that these people have. Big farmers lobbies $300 million every single year. But we'd say that a lot of things like social media and a lot of things like the medical industry are extremely inelastic goods. So even if these things like regulations exist, people still need that demand, and insofar as these companies are charging exorbitant prices, it means that a lot of these regulations don't work because people still need social media, people still need a lot of these goods. What you should believe at the end of this clash is that education gets far worse on their side of the house because A, it is speculative, but B, you're likely going to exacerbate a lot of these inequalities, but even if you don't believe that at the end, incentives are still bad from these social media companies, which means inherently they don't have an incentive to keep them learning, they have an incentive to keep them scrolling reels, doom scrolling, etc. Okay, next on things like the environment. They tell us that companies have an incentive to do things such as pro-climate goods, such as have images such as pro-climate images. We'd say a few things here. Firstly, note that all of my analysis previously, talking to you about the resource struggle, is extremely important because note that as commercialization increases, it means that China needs a lot more resources. It means that America needs a lot more resources because there's exogenous demand. And because there is this exogenous demand, that means that there's a lot more stuff. And if you have more stuff and you have more demand, that means you need more resources. So it doesn't matter that companies have the incentive to do things such as pro-climate initiatives. They don't have the capacity to do so because resources are literally running out right now. Finally then, they talk about mutually assured destruction. But we'd say that this grows disproportionately because obviously the power currently resides in the US, China, Russia, North Korea, etc. Insofar as their military base grows, it means that they can put leverage on countries disproportionately. Because note that not every single country is just going to grow in terms of nuclear power. Obviously, that means that, for example, China and the US can put a lot of threats on developing countries like Africa. That's extremely important because that means that A, they will get resources, but B, it means inequality will increase because obviously these developing countries can't keep up with these developed countries in terms of capacity. At the end of this debate then, what you have to weigh on is a few things. First, you have to weigh that everything there is speculative. We don't know how AI is going to progress. We don't know how a lot of these things are going to progress. What is certain on our side of the house is that people still have access to information. People are not polarized yet. People still have access to good healthcare. And note that, people still have access to good healthcare. For all those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the third speaker for their speech, and as is customary, we now reverse the speaking order for the leaders replied of the negating team.
Look, we're not crystal balls. This isn't a debate where we have to predict the future. Maybe the world is slightly nicer in 100 years. Maybe the world is a bit more peaceful in 100 years. That could all be true, but we can still win because F is betting absolutely everything on the off chance that things all work out. Two things I'm going to talk about in the speech. First, the push on politics. Second, the push on technology. I'll be attaching some discussion of burdens at the end of all of this. Great. First, on politics, I think both sides wax lyrical here. But I think at the end of this, you should believe that the world is just a less stable place. Josh demolishes their main mechanism about why people probably don't learn from the past, and it's really hard for them to do that in the present. What that means then is you should believe as climate change gets worse, resources dry up and make politics less stable. As technological growth advances, it makes society less equal and more unstable. As media becomes more sensational, that makes the politics more unstable. Note the impacts of this then. That looks like more discrimination for marginalized groups. That looks like more arbitrary detention and being carted off to El Salvador. That looks like more polarization, more instability, more war, more bombs and missiles flying. Great. At the end of this then, you should actually not want to be born 100 years from now. But that's not our burden in this debate. The fact that there is a pretty decent chance that this is the world that AF has to defend should make you not want to take this risk in the first place, because AF is the one that's making the change in this debate. AF is the one that's taking the risk. A risk that, if I may remind you, I told you at second, could ruin your life, could inform how you live your life, could inform if you live in a Syrian refugee camp or here in Auckland. Life is relatively comfy now. Don't throw away that chance. You should not want to take that risk in the first place. But then let's move on to technology. I think the same metric and the same lens applies with this clash. A few things here. A few things here. First, I think we can show that the future is an actively unappealing place to live, right? Because what does Misty tell you? She tells you that as time goes on, that empowers the worst part of the technology industry. That looks like more addictive technologies that try and destroy your connection with the natural world to increase companies' profit. That looks like more invasive technology that blurs the line between the human and technological and actively makes life an unlivable hell. But it looks like technology that destroys the environment because these companies can get away with it. It looks like more climate change, that looks like more environmental degradation. But again, at the end of this point, the lens you should view this debate through is the risk. Because we can assume that everything they say on maybe the world is a slightly nicer place to live in 100 years is true. We can say that perhaps they can cure cancer in 100 years. But the fact that there is a reasonably significant chance that none of this is true is the fact that that all of these benefits are quite speculative. That means that you should prefer the world you currently have. Even if it is an evil, it's an evil that you know, it's an evil that you can know how to contend with. Great. At the end of the day then, I think that every benefit that they can field is speculative. It happens literally 100 years from now. What that means then is that you shouldn't take this chance. You shouldn't play Russian roulette with your life. So proud to stand against.
I thank the negating speaker for that speech, and I welcome back up the first speaker of the Affirmative team to close out this debate.
On the Affirmative team today, we have proved to you how the world 100 years in the future will be a much better, safer place to live. The negating team is acting like the world today is a fine place to live, but I have proved to you at first that it's politically unstable and that the technology we have nowadays is not safe and has not been regulated in the same way it would be 100 years in the future. The negating team have created a speculative dystopian future which would ruin everyone's lives, but we have shown you on the Affirmative team a realistic future which is a safer place to live in. The two main points in this debate today was the political climate and the technology of the future. We brought up at first how people will be more educated politically, resulting in less extremism, which would be a much safer political climate for people because they would know what kind of people they want in charge. The negating team then told us that people would actually not be educated because of AI and they wouldn't know what's real and everyone would be online and there would be no regulations. Well, we've actually told you also at first that there would be more regulations for artificial intelligence and such because of we can see these regulations starting to become, and now people will be more informed on the long-term effects, which means their argument against this point does not stand in this debate. Therefore, we went on the point that people will be more politically educated and then are likely to vote for less extremist parties. On to the main point about technology. First of all, I told you about the positive technology that could happen in this world. I had a very strong mechanism on the positive medical technology advancements we can make, and I think overall we told you that this would mean that people are generally healthier and can live longer, which should be weighed very highly in this debate, especially because we heard no rebuttal about the improved medical technology. And in fact, the main rebuttal about technology that we heard from the negating team was first of all that there'd be more addiction because governments won't care apparently, and also AI will control your life, and additionally there will be more nuclear power. Well, as I actually told you at first, there won't be as much nuclear power because even if we say, okay, let's say we accept that people are going to make more nuclear weapons, we're still at this mutually, a mutual destructive standpoint, which just means that it doesn't matter anyway because no one's going to be using them. So we should weigh medical advancements and people being able to live longer and getting all this technology way higher than maybe some countries made another nuclear weapon that's still not being used, that's still just sitting unused in this debate, which is why we win this point. Additionally, they told us there'd be more addiction, but like I mentioned before, like we've shown you how like governments will have like a reason to regulate these because we'll know the long-term effects. And we've also mentioned again, they told like one tech company will monopolize and control this. But again, we've also told you that this is not true because other tech companies will rise up because they want, if this technology is so prominent as both of us seem to be in both of our cases, other tech companies will want to make use of this money. Therefore, there will be competition and there will be also like a reason for the governments to step in and control this. They've also told us that AI is going to be like the reason people are less educated because they don't know which AI to pick. But as we've told you at first of all, AI isn't the only access to information on the internet. Like it's not the only thing that's going to exist in the future. We'll still have things like Google. And also we've told you multiple times that like these like AI fact checkers already exist nowadays, misinformation, these will only improve in the future, especially as like people have a more like, as we mentioned, people are already like skeptical of AI, so there will be like a much higher reason for this to exist in the future if it becomes as important as we all seem to think it will be. There was like a minor point, which is why we win this technology point, which was like the main point in this debate. There was also a minor point on like which like side will have better equality. The neg assumes like that trends seem to just like stay the same, but we've seen in the past that actually these things change. We've seen this like with the civil rights movement that was mentioned at my third. So we can just see that this is not going to be true, and we're not actually going to live in this like dystopian future where everyone's like all the minorities are hated on and like AI is taken over and there's one tech company controlling everything. We just see this is like point blank not true, and actually the future is going to be a much safer place than now. Because now we have, as I mentioned at first again, extremism in politics, we have an unsafe economy, we have like the technology, we don't know how it's going to be used, which means these things in the future, especially if we weigh up things like medical advancements and like a less extreme society, are just going to be way better, and we can see that this is a better society. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you everyone for a wonderful debate. I invite the teams to now cross the floor and shake hands, and we'll end the lines. Oh, awesome.